Before it was a land of fast food and even faster Wi-Fi, the United States was a canvas of unspoiled wilderness. From majestic mountain ranges to endless plains, this vast land was home to thriving Native American civilizations, centuries before a man in tights named Columbus stumbled upon it. Spoiler alert. He wasn't the hero of this story. The indigenous peoples of North America were as diverse as the flavors at a barbecue joint. Over 600 distinct tribes thrived here, speaking more than 300 languages and crafting societies rich in art, science, and diplomacy. And no, they weren't just waiting for Europeans to show up and name everything after themselves. From the ancestral Pueblones carving homes into cliffs in the Southwest to the Iroquois Confederacy setting up their version of a pre-Broadway democracy, Native Americans had it all figured out. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe was, well, Europe, always in search of spices, gold, and occasionally, a place to dump their troublemakers. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and promptly got lost. When he finally hit land, he thought he'd reached India. Fun fact, Columbus was so bad at directions that we still call Native Americans Indians today. Fast forward a century, and the Europeans are arriving in droves. Spain was busy building missions, France was setting up fur trade posts, and the English, well, they were planting the seeds of what would eventually become America, and a lot of problems. Pilgrim, wait, so corn just grows, like, from the ground? Native American? Yes, again, for the 50th time, yes, and stop calling it maize. Nobody calls it maize. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies were thriving, but the honeymoon with Mother England was coming to an end. Think of it as a teenager realizing their parents' rules are dumb, and their allowance isn't enough. King George III, bless his royal wig, decided the colonies should help pay for the British Empire's costly wars. Enter the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the world's least popular beverage tax, the Tea Act. The colonist, wait, we're paying more for tea, and we don't even get a seat in Parliament. What's next? Taxes on the air we breathe. The colonists weren't having it. The phrase, no taxation without representation, became their battle cry, which, let's face it, is just a fancy way of saying, don't boss me around. Then came the Boston Tea Party, where a group of rebellious Bostonians decided to turn the harbor into the world's largest cup of herbal infusion. British soldier, do they realize tea is expensive? That's like throwing lobster into the harbor. The colonies soon formed the Continental Congress, where they debated how to deal with England. Picture a dysfunctional family dinner, except everyone's wearing wigs and trying to invent democracy. With tensions boiling over, the colonies decided it was time to break up with England. Enter Thomas Jefferson, tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, all men are created equal. That's good, but let's add, except the guy who double-dipped at the tavern last night. The declaration wasn't just a breakup letter, it was a mic drop heard around the world. On July 4, 1776, it was officially adopted, and suddenly, 13 scrappy colonies were telling the most powerful empire on earth to, well, buzz off. Leading this audacious revolution was George Washington, the man who could chop down a cherry tree but couldn't tell a lie. Spoiler alert. He probably didn't actually chop down a cherry tree, but hey, the myth stuck. The war that followed was a David and Goliath tale, with the underdog colonies taking on the British juggernaut. And while Washington was busy crossing the Delaware and looking heroic on horseback, Benjamin Franklin was in France sweet-talking their king into joining the fight. Franklin, to French king, join us, and you'll get to annoy England for free. Who could say no to that? Against all odds, the colonies won. In 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the United States was officially recognized as independent. Answer, a nation was born, not perfect, not unified, but undeniably revolutionary. So, the United States was finally independent. But now came the hard part, actually being a country. The Articles of Confederation, America's first attempt at government, was like the IKEA instruction manual of politics, vague, incomplete, and missing key pieces. Picture this, 13 states acting like roommates who refused to do their share of the chores. Each one had its own currency, laws, and ideas about governance. Pennsylvania, to Virginia, hey, your cows keep wandering into my field. Either build a fence or teach them geography. Virginia, you could just feed them. Sharing is caring. Pennsylvania, sharing. Last week, you taxed my grain shipments. The government had no real power to mediate disputes or collect taxes. It was like a landlord who couldn't enforce rent but still expected the plumbing to work. Then there was the debt. Oh, the debt. The Revolutionary War wasn't cheap, and the fledgling nation owed money to France, the Netherlands, and even some of its own citizens. French ambassador, to Congress, so, about that loan, When can we expect repayment? Congressman, muttering, maybe when pigs fly or taxes actually work. The cherry on top, foreign nations weren't exactly taking America seriously. Britain and Spain were still hanging around, poking at the borders like pesky neighbors testing property lines. Fast forward to May 1787. Representatives from 12 states, Rhode Island decided it had better things to do, gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitution Convention. Imagine a summer camp for middle-aged men in powdered wigs. The assignment? Create a government strong enough to unite the states but not so strong it starts acting like a monarch. The debates were intense. Big states wanted representation based on population, while smaller states clung to the idea of equal votes. It was like deciding how to split a pizza between friends who all think their hunger is more important. Big state rep, dramatic, we have more people, so naturally, we should have more say. Small state rep, equally dramatic, and we have fewer people, so naturally, we should have just as much say. After much yelling, and probably some ale, they compromised with a two-house legislature. The House of Representatives would be based on population, and the Senate would give each state equal representation. Hamilton, Madison, I've got ideas. Picture this: a national bank, a strong federal government, maybe even a musical about me in the future. Madison, focus. Hamilton, we're trying to fix the articles, not write your autobiography. Hamilton, just saying, I'm not throwing away my shot, has a nice ring to it. Once the Constitution was drafted, it still needed approval. But some folks weren't sold on the idea of a powerful federal government. Enter the anti-federalists, who were basically the skeptical friend in every group chat. Anti-federalist, what if the government gets too big and crushes individual freedoms? We need guarantees. Thus, the Bill of Rights was born, a top 10 list of freedoms to calm everyone down. Federalist, smirking, fine, you want free speech, the right to bear arms, and a speedy trial. Done. Can we move on now? The Bill of Rights was like a relationship prenup. Here's what the government can't do, just so we're clear. James Madison, the quiet intellectual powerhouse, was the unsung hero of the whole operation. While others debated loudly, he worked tirelessly behind the scenes, drafting proposals and keeping the conversation on track. Madison was like the group project member who does all the work while everyone else argues over the PowerPoint font. Madison, we need checks and balances, Mr. President. 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. Washington, 3 branches, sounds like a tree. Will it grow money? Madison, no, but it'll stop any one branch from becoming too powerful. Washington, fine, but only if I get to lead one of them. Even after the Constitution was ratified in 1788, the new government faced growing pains. The states were still wary of losing power, and political parties began to form almost immediately. If the founding of America was a reality show, this was the part where alliances formed and drama escalated. Federalist, strong central government or bust. Democratic Republican, back off. Power belongs to the states. There were disagreements about everything, from trade policies to how much power the president should have. Random citizen, wait, we just fought a war to escape tyranny, and now we're arguing about giving one guy too much power. Didn't we learn anything? By 1790, the capital moved to a swampy area called Washington, D.C., where the government began settling into its new home. Picture a bustling construction site with a lot of pointing and shouting. The White House wasn't finished, so President Washington lived in a rented house. Talk about humble beginnings. Carpenter, why does everything have to be so big and grand? Couldn't they just meet in a barn? Colleague, trust me, they're going to argue enough without adding the smell of hay to the mix. The nearly completed Capitol building, framing it against a rising sun inside, representatives are seen debating passionately. Outside, citizens gather, hopeful yet uncertain about what this new government will mean. And so, the United States began its grand experiment in democracy, a nation built not just on laws but on the stubborn belief that they could figure it out as they went along. But while the Constitution promised a unified government, cracks began to show in the foundation of this great experiment. And by cracks, I mean massive, gaping chasms of disagreement about who should do what, where, and, oh yes, who gets to own people. You see, the North was all about industry and progress, while the South was still clinging to, well, this. Slavery was the bedrock of the Southern economy, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. And by fight, I mean a literal war. But we're not quite there yet. The 19th century in America was basically a really messy group chat. On one side, you had abolitionists demanding the end of slavery. On the other, Southern leaders yelling, "You can't tell us what to do. States' rights, y'all." Spoiler, States' rights was code for, we want to keep owning people. And in walks this guy, Abraham Lincoln, a self-taught lawyer who somehow managed to become president despite looking like he hadn't slept in 10 years. Honest Abe wasn't just a man of the people, he was the man to lead the country through its darkest hour. Lincoln, to himself, a house divided against itself cannot stand. That line right there, straight fire. But not everyone thought so. Southern politician number 1. What's this Lincoln fellow talking about? Divided houses. Does he think he's a carpenter or something? Southern politician number 2, chuckling. Well, he sure ain't welcome in ours. And thus, the stage was set for the Civil War. But first, let's talk about why everyone was so angry. In 3 words, slavery, sectionalism, and sass. Okay, mostly slavery. The North and South weren't just disagreeing about slavery, they were basically living in 2 different worlds. The North had factories, railroads, and abolitionist newspapers. The South had plantations, cotton, and an extremely selective interpretation of the Constitution. Mary Todd Lincoln. Abe, you've got to sleep. You can't fix the country on no rest and black coffee alone. Lincoln. I'll rest when the Union is saved, Mary. Fun fact, Lincoln was basically the original workaholic. Also, his inauguration in 1861 was the least chill one in history. While Abe was out here saying stuff like, we are not enemies, but friends, half the southern states were like, cool speech, bro, but we're leaving anyway. And just like that, the Union lost 11 states, Jefferson Davis became the Confederacy's president, and the Civil War kicked off in April 1861 with the Battle of Fort Sumter. Union soldier, why are they shooting at us? We're just sitting here. Confederate soldier, because we can. And so began 4 years of absolute chaos. The Civil War wasn't just about bullets and bayonets. It was about strategies, egos, and, occasionally, really bad ideas. Lincoln, off-screen. General, why haven't you attacked yet? McClellan, nervously. I need more time to prepare. Lincoln, deadpan. You've had more time than my son takes to get ready for church. Let's move. McClellan, bless his heart, was more into planning than fighting. Lincoln eventually replaced him, because, well, losing wasn't an option. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states free. This was a bold move that changed the game. Confederate officer, wait, they can do that. Union officer, they just did. Lincoln, writing, shall we stop this cruel war by giving freedom to all? Mary Todd Lincoln, you always did have a flair for drama, Abe. Lincoln, smirking, someone's got to keep it interesting. By 1863, the war hit its boiling point. The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest clash, but it also marked a turning point for the Union. Lincoln, though, 7 years ago. This speech, absolute chills. Lincoln gave America its rallying cry for democracy. By April 1865, the Confederacy was out of options, out of money, and out of patience. General Lee surrendered to General Grant, and just like that, the Civil War ended. But the war left scars, on the land, on the people, and on the soul of the nation. And for Lincoln, his hardest days were still ahead. Lincoln, rebuilding is harder than tearing down. The Civil War may have ended, but the scars were fresh. The South was in shambles, and the North wasn't exactly throwing a victory party either. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a new chapter. One filled with rebuilding, reconciliation, and, oh yes, a whole lot of arguing. A bustling Congress chamber, where politicians are shouting over one another. The Northern politician number 1, we need to rebuild the South. Invest in infrastructure, schools, and industry. Southern politician, you mean our infrastructure, our schools, and our industry that you burned to the ground. Northern politician number 2, well, maybe you shouldn't have started a war over, oh, I don't know, owning people. Southern politician, states' rights. Northern politician number 1, eye roll. Here we go again. Welcome to Reconstruction, the 12-year period where the US tried to put itself back together, like a vase shattered in a rage room. The government had big plans, but the execution, let's just say it was less than smooth. A small, overcrowded room where African American families are lining up for assistance. Freedman, wait, I'm free now, but I can't get land. Bureau agent, tired, well, technically, yes, but practically, no. Freedman, so, what am I supposed to do? Bureau agent, shrugs, Good luck. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help newly freed African Americans transition into society. They provided food, education, and even helped some find jobs. But land, the promised 40 acres and a mule, yeah, that didn't quite happen. A group of former Confederate soldiers gathers under a tree, whispering, "Soldier, really, Bill, a sack? You couldn't even find a proper hood." Bill, muffled, "I'm on a budget." Reconstruction wasn't just about rebuilding infrastructure, it was about rebuilding trust. And let's just say not everyone was on board with that idea. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, aiming to terrorize African Americans and maintain the status quo of white supremacy. Education became a cornerstone of Reconstruction efforts. For the first time, African Americans were learning to read and write in large numbers. Schools were popping up everywhere, despite pushback from, well, racists. Well, I am also black men behind the video. Ha ha ha. Douglas, Reconstruction isn't just about rebuilding the South, it's about rebuilding the soul of this nation. Equality is not a privilege, it is a right. Frederick Douglass was one of the loudest voices for equality during Reconstruction. A former slave-turned-author, speaker, and all-around rock star, Douglass pushed the nation to live up to its promises. President Andrew Johnson sits at his desk. Secretary: "Sir, Congress is just going to override this veto, you know." Johnson: "Then I'll veto the override." Secretary: "That's not how it works." Johnson, muttering, "Stupid Congress." Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, was not exactly a fan of Reconstruction. In fact, he did everything he could to slow it down, vetoing bills left and right. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well for him. An African-American family: "Son, Daddy, are we free now?" Father: "Yes, son, but freedom ain't free." For many African Americans, freedom came with strings attached. Sharecropping became the new form of slavery. Work the land, give most of the profits to the landowner, and try not to starve. Justices sit in a grand courtroom, debating the 14th and 15th Amendments. Justice number 1. So, everyone gets equal protection under the law. Justice number 2. In theory. Justice number 1. And the right to vote. Justice number 2. Again, in theory. Justice number 1. So why do I feel like this is going to end poorly? Justice number 2. Because it will. The 14th and 15th Amendments were monumental, granting citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. But enforcement, let's just say it was selective. Amid the struggles, the African American community found strength in faith. Churches became the center of their lives, offering not just spiritual guidance but also a sense of unity and purpose. The first African American congressman Revels: "This is only the beginning. We will not rest until justice is served." Hiram Revels and others like him proved that African Americans could and would lead, but their time in Congress was short-lived, as Southern states quickly found ways to undermine progress. A group of white men discusses new voting laws. Man number 1: "If they can't pay, they can't vote." Man number 2: "And if they try, we'll make sure they regret it." Poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence became the tools of suppression. Reconstruction's promise of equality was slipping away. Reconstruction's promise of equality was slipping away, and the nation turned its gaze toward industry and progress, a golden facade that concealed the rust underneath. America was changing. The iron rails of industry snaked across the land, binding east to west and small towns to burgeoning cities. The steam engine became the beating heart of a new era, the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, a name both fitting and ironic, coined by Mark Twain. Beneath the golden sheen of wealth and innovation lay greed, corruption, and exploitation. Take Andrew Carnegie, for example. A Scottish immigrant with humble beginnings, he would rise to dominate the steel industry, pioneering methods that built America's skyscrapers and bridges. A huge foundry, molten steel pours into forms as workers toil amid sparks and smoke. Carnegie, to his foreman: "Efficiency, my friend. That's the secret. If we cut costs by a penny, we make millions." Carnegie's empire rested on hard work, innovation, and, well, paying his workers as little as possible. And then there was John D. Rockefeller, the man who turned oil into black gold. Where Carnegie believed in steel and philanthropy, Rockefeller believed in oil and annihilation. His company, Standard Oil, swallowed competitors whole, creating a monopoly that made him the richest man in modern history. Rockefeller, calmly, to his lawyer: "Competition? Why compete when you can simply acquire?" And while the industrial titans built their empires, the workers who fueled their rise began to push back. The labor movement was born from necessity. Factory workers labored 12-hour days in unsafe conditions for barely enough to survive. Even children worked in these so-called temples of progress, their small hands perfect for the machinery, and perfect for the exploitation. Organizer, to the crowd: "We build their empires. It's time we demand our share of the wealth." Strikes and protests rocked the nation, Some turned violent, like the infamous Haymarket Riot of 1886, a fight for workers' rights, or as the industrial barons called it, anarchy. But the laborers weren't all American-born. Waves of immigrants flooded into cities, drawn by promises of opportunity and freedom. Immigrant, in broken English, I come here for the American dream. Not to work in a sweatshop. Instead of a dream, many found overcrowded tenements, dangerous jobs, and prejudice. The streets may have been paved with gold, but only for those who could afford it. For every dollar the industrialists flaunted, 100 workers earned a dime. The gap between rich and poor was as wide as the Grand Canyon. The era was gilded, sure, but gilding only covers what lies beneath. Carnegie, your move, Rockefeller. And try not to buy all the pieces this time. Rockefeller, smirking, why play the game when I can own the board? Even among titans, competition was fierce, and sometimes, hilariously petty. A journalist interviews J.P. Morgan, journalist, Mr. Morgan, what do you say to critics who claim you control too much of America's economy? J.P. Morgan, with a wry smile, control. I prefer expert guidance. Morgan didn't just guide the economy, he practically owned it. Immigrant workers discussing their wages. Worker 1, I got a raise today. I'm making 10 cents an hour now. Worker 2, careful, don't spend it all in one place. Worker 1, oh, I won't. I'm saving up for a loaf of bread. The humor of the working class, sharp, biting, and a survival tool. A strike leader rallies the crowd. Strike leader, if they can live on steak and champagne, we can live on dreams and sawdust. But not forever. Even in the face of oppression, the human spirit found ways to laugh, to hope, and to fight for a better tomorrow. The Gilded Age built America's foundation, a glittering empire of railroads, steel, and oil. But the cracks in that foundation were already beginning to show. This became a formidable weapon in his hand. The Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad trust, was among his most famous victories. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, marking a significant shift in the balance of power. But Roosevelt wasn't an ideologue. He didn't believe all trusts were inherently bad. Instead, he distinguished between good trusts, which served public interest, and bad trusts, which exploited consumers and workers. This nuanced approach earned him respect from both reformers and moderate labor rights. A new frontier. Roosevelt's commitment to fairness extended to labor. In 1902, the United States faced a major crisis, the coal strike. As winter loomed, miners demanded better wages and working conditions, while mine owners refused to negotiate. With millions of Americans dependent on coal for heat, the stakes were high. Roosevelt broke with precedent, inviting both sides to the White House to mediate a resolution. When the mine owners stubbornly resisted compromise, Roosevelt threatened to use federal troops to take over the mines, a bold move that ultimately forced a settlement. This marked the first time a president had intervened in a labor dispute on behalf of workers, setting a powerful precedent. Conservation, preserving America's beauty. While Roosevelt fought for fairness in industry and labor, he also turned his attention to a different battle. Conservation. America's natural resources were being exploited at an alarming rate, with forests cleared, rivers polluted, and wildlife hunted to near extinction. Roosevelt, an avid outdoorsman, recognized the need to protect the nation's natural heritage. He championed the creation of national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges, establishing over 230 million acres of protected land during his presidency. His efforts not only preserved the environment but also laid the foundation for the modern conservation movement. Humor in Roosevelt's tenacity. Roosevelt's presidency wasn't just marked by policy achievements. It was also filled with moments of humor and personality that endeared him to the public. Known for his boundless energy and love of adventure, Roosevelt often plunged into situations with an almost childlike enthusiasm. When asked about his relentless work ethic, he famously quipped, "I have a hard time thinking I'm working when I'm having so much fun." His wit extended to his political battles, where he referred to his opponents as malefactors of great wealth, while maintaining a twinkle in his eye that made it impossible to stay angry with him for long. One of his most famous anecdotes involved a hunting trip where he refused to shoot a tied-up bear, considering it unsportsmanlike. This incident inspired the creation of the teddy bear, a symbol of Roosevelt's larger-than-life persona. America on the world stage. Roosevelt's influence extended beyond domestic reform. He firmly believed that America had a role to play on the global stage. His foreign policy, famously summarized as "speak softly and carry a big stick," combined diplomacy with a willingness to use military force when necessary. One of his most significant achievements was the construction of the As the 20th century rolled onward, the nation that Theodore Roosevelt helped shape found itself grappling with a new and far graver challenge. The 1920s had roared, an era of jazz, flappers, and unchecked speculation. But in October 1929, the glittering facade of prosperity shattered like a dropped champagne glass. The stock market crash didn't just send Wall Street brokers into a frenzy. It unleashed a tidal wave of economic despair. Banks failed, factories closed, and bread lines stretched around city blocks. By the early 1930s, the United States wasn't just bruised, it was gasping for air. The Great Depression wasn't a storm, it was a suffocating fog, settling over the nation with no end in sight. And then, from the shadows of Hyde Park, emerged a man whose name would soon become synonymous with hope: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By the time FDR was elected president in 1932, unemployment had soared to 25%. Families lost homes, farmers faced foreclosure, and even the rich were trading yachts for canned beans. The American dream, more like the American nightmare. The Dust Bowl only added insult to injury. Entire swaths of farmland turned to wasteland, leaving families with nothing but the clothes on their backs and an aching uncertainty about tomorrow. Even the guys who caused the mess weren't immune. Poetic justice, perhaps. But Franklin Roosevelt wasn't a man to flinch in the face of adversity. Paralyzed from the waist down due to polio, he knew better than most the meaning of resilience. With a charismatic grin and a voice that radiated optimism, FDR connected with Americans in a way no leader before him had. In a time of darkness, Roosevelt's fireside chats were more than just speeches. They were lifelines. FDR, my friends, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. In just 15 minutes, Roosevelt could do what no bank bailout or soup kitchen could. He gave people hope. A father turns to his son. Father, that man sounds like he knows what he's doing. Son, does he know we're eating turnip soup for the 4th day in a row? Father, maybe, but at least we're not eating the turnips raw. Roosevelt's optimism wasn't just infectious, it was downright therapeutic. With the stroke of a pen and an audacious vision, Roosevelt unleashed the New Deal. Foreman, never thought I'd see the day I'd be making a river behave. Turns out, rivers are less stubborn than Congress. The Civilian Conservation Corps, one of Roosevelt's most beloved programs, put thousands of unemployed young men to work on conservation projects. CCC workers at campfire. Young worker, think the trees we planted today will outlive us. Foreman, if they don't, we're doing something wrong. Roosevelt didn't just save lives, he reforested hope. Perhaps the New Deal's most enduring legacy was the social safety net it created. Social Security offered dignity to the elderly, unemployment insurance gave workers a lifeline, and bank reforms ensured that Americans would never again lose their life savings overnight. An elderly couple receiving their first Social Security check. Husband, think they'll send us another next month? Wife, better, or I'm knitting our banker a sweater, out of barbed wire. FDR's reforms didn't solve every problem, but they made sure America wouldn't fall apart at the seams. But for many, the New Deal wasn't enough. The Dust Bowl pushed thousands of farmers off their land, forcing them westward in search of a better life. A weathered pickup truck rattles down a dirt road. Little girl, Mama, why's the sky so angry? Mother, because we forgot to be kind to it. Sweetheart, it was a migration of desperation and hope. As Roosevelt battled economic despair at home, the world teetered on the edge of chaos. In Europe and Asia, dictators were on the rise, each one more dangerous than the last. The storm was gathering, and America's self-imposed isolation couldn't keep it at bay forever. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. America was no longer a bystander, it was a target. Roosevelt, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Overnight, factories shifted from making cars to tanks, and farmers planted crops not just for Americans but for the Allies. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, churning out planes, tanks, and ammunition at a pace that left the Axis powers reeling. Rosie the Riveter, we can do it, and faster than you think. With 18 million women entering the workforce, America's economy roared back to life, fueled by patriotism and necessity. While America fought on two fronts, Roosevelt's diplomacy was equally crucial. He worked tirelessly with Churchill and Stalin to forge the Allied strategy that would eventually topple the Axis. Stalin and Churchill exchanged sly grins as FDR suggests a toast. FDR, to victory, and may Stalin's vodka be less lethal than his tanks. Stalin, laughing, you first, Franklin. By 1945, the war was nearly over. 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to demand jobs and freedom. King's "I Have a Dream" speech electrified the crowd and echoed across the globe. Humorous interlude: after King's speech, a reporter approaches a man wiping tears from his eyes. Reporter: "Was the speech moving for you?" Man: "Moving? I'm inspired to quit my job and join the movement. Problem is, my wife says I can't afford the dream." The movement's momentum led to landmark victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 struck down segregation in public spaces. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled barriers that had kept African Americans from the ballot box. But success didn't come without struggle. Marchers were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, children faced fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham, and activists like Medgar Evers and Viola Liuzzo paid the ultimate price for their courage. Humorous interlude: a white sheriff looks at a group of marching protesters. Sheriff: "They just keep coming back. It's like swatting flies." Deputy: "Except these flies have signs and a lot of stamina." King's philosophy of nonviolence wasn't always popular. Even within the movement, younger activists grew impatient, favoring more confrontational tactics. But King remained steadfast, believing that hate could never drive out hate. King: "To an angry young activist, violence might feel satisfying for a moment, but it won't get us to the promised land." Activist: "The promised land's taking too long. I'd settle for a seat at the lunch counter." Despite divisions, King pressed on. He expanded his fight to include economic justice, organizing the Poor People's Campaign to address inequality on a broader scale. In Memphis, he stood with striking sanitation workers, carrying signs that declared, "I am a man." It was a simple statement but a powerful reminder of the humanity that segregation sought to deny. Humorous interlude: a sanitation worker smiles as King joins the march. Worker: "Dr. King, you ever pick up trash before?" King, laughing: "Every time I read the news." But the fight took its toll. King's life was constantly under threat, and the strain showed. On April 4, 1968, while standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, he was assassinated. His death sent shockwaves through the nation and the world. Yet his dream didn't die with him. It lived on in the civil rights movement he helped to build and in the hearts of those who refused to let hatred have the final word. Humorous interlude: a man reads about King's assassination in the paper and turns to his son. Man: "They killed the dreamer, but they forgot one thing." Son: "What's that?" Man: "Dreams don't die." The civil rights movement changed America forever. It didn't solve every problem. Racism didn't evaporate overnight, but it cracked open doors that had long been locked and gave millions a glimpse of what justice could look like. King's legacy isn't just written in history books. It's etched into the soul of a nation that continues to strive toward the ideals he preached: liberty, equality, and a dream of a better tomorrow. As America turned its eyes toward new challenges, the echoes of King's words continued to ring. And though the journey was far from over, his dream remained a guiding light. The average citizen suddenly had a lot more questions about space, and about why the Soviets seemed to be winning. Kennedy rallied the nation with one of his most famous speeches. Kennedy, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard." This speech electrified the nation, though somewhere, a NASA engineer muttered, "Hard, that's an understatement, Mr. President." The Apollo program became a monumental effort involving over 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians. The workdays were long, the calculations were intense, and the coffee machines probably deserved their own medals. In July 1969, the world watched in awe as Neil Armstrong descended from the lunar module and delivered the immortal line, "Armstrong, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Of course, Buzz Aldrin was right behind him, possibly thinking, "Don't forget there's two of us up here, Neil." The space race wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was a statement. America had proven its technological and innovative prowess, and for a moment, the world looked to the stars instead of the divisions on Earth. While Americans celebrated their lunar triumph, a far more complicated reality was unfolding in Vietnam. The US had entered Vietnam under the banner of stopping communism. The domino theory warned that if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. What started with a few military advisors quickly escalated into a full-blown war. The jungles of Vietnam were unforgiving. Soldiers faced not only an elusive enemy but also sweltering heat, dense vegetation, and the occasional very angry wildlife. Soldier, writing a letter home, "Dear Mom, it's hot, it's confusing, and if one more mosquito bites me, I'm defecting to Canada." Back in the US, the war became increasingly unpopular. Protests erupted on college campuses, and draft dodgers found creative ways to avoid service, some more effective than others. Protester, chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" The Vietnam War became a defining issue of the 1960s, revealing deep divisions in American society. Amid the chaos of the Vietnam War and Cold War tensions, the fight for justice at home continued. Following Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson stepped in and pushed forward the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This landmark legislation outlawed segregation in public spaces and banned employment discrimination. It was a monumental step forward, though it didn't come without resistance. Johnson, "We're not just passing a law, we're changing the soul of a nation." Despite its significance, many clung to their "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," became one of the most awkward denials in history. Clinton's presidency oversaw economic prosperity, a budget surplus, and a tech boom that changed the world. Silicon Valley was no longer just a place for engineers to tinker. It became the birthplace of a digital revolution. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Google turned the internet from a curiosity into a necessity. Suddenly, America wasn't just exporting movies and fast food. It was exporting the future. A new millennium, a new challenge. The 21st century began with optimism, which was quickly shattered on September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were a gut punch to the nation. America responded with a resolve that was both inspiring and controversial. President George W. Bush launched the War on Terror, a global effort to combat terrorism. The invasion of Afghanistan was swift, but the subsequent war in Iraq proved far more divisive. Intelligence suggesting weapons of mass destruction turned out to be as reliable as a used car salesman's promises. Still, the war reshaped the Middle East and America's global role. At home, the Patriot Act expanded government surveillance, leading to debates about privacy and security. Americans reluctantly traded some freedoms for the promise of safety. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security became a household name, though its TSA agents gained notoriety for confiscating shampoo bottles larger than 3 ounces. The rise of Obama and a new era in 2008. History was made as Barack Obama became the first African-American president. His campaign slogan, "Yes, we can," inspired a nation that was grappling with a financial crisis. The housing market had collapsed, and Wall Street's reckless behavior had left Main Street reeling. Obama's presidency brought sweeping changes, including the Affordable Care Act, which sought to provide health care to millions. Critics called it a government overreach, while supporters saw it as a moral imperative. Meanwhile, Obama's charisma made him a global rock star. Obama, jokingly, "I've been called worse on the basketball court." The killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011 marked a significant victory in the war on terror, yet, challenges remained. The rise of ISIS, cyber warfare, and climate change highlighted the complexities of modern geopolitics. Technology's transformative power. The 21st century saw technology become both a blessing and a curse. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram connected people across the globe, but they also became breeding grounds for misinformation and division. Suddenly, everyone had a platform, whether they deserved one or not. Choose to create.